Good morning, friends. It is indeed a pleasure to welcome you to this satellite-based interactive program. It is a privilege that today I have with me Professor Vaibhav Bhai Kothari. He is an assistant professor at Samarpan Arts and Commerce College, Department of English. Friends, today we are going to talk about a very well-known novelist of English literature, Jane Austen. The topic is Jane Austen, a novelist. Before we begin, I would like to give you a brief outline of our presentation. It goes like this, that we shall first talk about the biographical details. Then Vaibhav Bhai will tell you something about the historical background of Jane Austen. Then I will tell you something about Austen's major works. That will be a kind of introduction. And then Vaibhav Bhai will tell you something about the thematic preoccupations that we find in Jane Austen's novels. Now have a look at this picture. This beautiful picture was made by Jane Austen's sister. That was at around the beginning of 19th century, and this is the modern version of this beautiful picture. Friends, Jane Austen is a very prolific, prominent, significant and a renowned novelist. Not only the students of English literature, but also the students of other disciplines, and any layman will tell you at least something about Jane Austen. So she is such a popular name today in all the literatures. But also it is true that her novels have been read by many readers all over the world, and at the same time her novels have been celebrated by making into films, revisions of films, also into television serials. She is such a popular name today. Unfortunately, the author herself, the novelist herself, Jane Austen, she could not enjoy the success during her own lifetime because she had to publish her novels anonymously. This is only because she was born as a woman, and writing was considered as a male genre where woman was not supposed to enter. It was a patriarchal social system that in which Jane Austen had entered, and when she wrote her novels, she was severely criticized. She could not, first of all, she published her novels with a pseudonym, a lady, and then anonymously also. So this reminds me, Vaibhav Bhai, of one Greek mythology. It is the story of Philomela. Philomela was a poetess. She was a singer. She had beautiful voice. She was in Greece. This is the story of ancient times. It's a mythology. And Philomela, she was once harassed by Theseus, a knight. Philomela, she started complaining about Theseus in her poems. And then Theseus, he sent his soldiers to cut her tongue. Philomela was made speechless. She was made tongueless, and yet she did not stop singing her songs. She went on singing her songs. People could not understand her language, and yet she did not stop. I think this is what happened with Jane Austen also. Nobody could understand her language, and she was being criticized for being a very domestic novelist, one who writes about petty themes. That's what the traditional critics believe. But this is also true for a woman who lives within the four walls of her family, probably like Richardson or Henry Fielding. Jane Austen did not have the exposure to go out. That's why probably she could not write about the adventures. This Jane Austen, she was not known during her lifetime. Even after her life, we find some of her criticism somewhere in articles or in some reports. But it was around 1939 that the first book came out. Almost 100 years after her death, a book came out called Jane Austen and Her Art. And the credit goes to Virginia Woolf, who around 1929-1930s in her essays mentioned Jane Austen as one of the wonderful woman writers. and she up to an extent that she calls her the best writer among women. So that credit goes to Virginia Woolf, and that is the best tribute given by one artist to another, one novelist to another, when she calls her the best novelist. So it was around 1939 that people took Jane Austen seriously, and started giving their opinions in the modern criticism. Again, around 1960s, with the coming up of feminist criticism, Jane Austen was revised. And in 1970, with the coming up of gynocriticism, which is centered around woman or a woman's writing, it says that a woman has special female bonding, and that female bonding is very much there in Jane Austen's novels. So Jane Austen, who was being criticized for being so very feminine, now the feminist critics, the feminist readers, they believe, not only gynocritics, the womanists also believe that a woman has a special female bonding, and that is also known as a sisterhood among women. So after 1970s and womanism after 1990s, now she has been appreciated all over the world by women writers, to an extent that most of the feminist criticism, it begins with Jane Austen. She is also known as the mother of English novel. Like Richardson as the father of English novel, Jane Austen as the mother of English novel. So it is very interesting to note that in 2010, that is recently, Harold Jacobson, who received a Booker Prize, he is known as a Jewish Jane Austen. So now imagine a writer who worked anonymously. Now her name is used as a nomenclature for Harold Jacobson. So this is the journey that Jane Austen has covered. Friends, now it is time for us to look at some of her biographical details. Jane Austen was, as you can see on your screen, she was born on 16 December 1775 in the village of Steventon in Hampshire County, England. She was the daughter of Cassandra Leigh and the Reverend George Austen. There were 6 brothers and 1 sister. The one sister is also known as Cressida, and Jane Austen was very close to her sister, and because it was such a huge family, in her novels we find that there is no the concept of nuclear family. All her characters are into huge families. The best part about Jane Austen was she was tutored at home, and thanks to her father, and she was sent to school and attended the Abbey School in Reading, Berkshire. This was when women were not being educated, they were not sent for education, and her father, who was also an Oxford graduate, he was a clergyman. He was a very well-read person. He had a library of around 500 great volumes. So he sent Jane Austen to school. That was a wonderful work that father did for his daughter. And this is Jane Austen's house in Hampshire. It is turned into a museum, and all her works have been kept. The original documents, manuscripts are kept there in this museum named as Jane Austen's Museum. Now, in around 1801, from Hampshire, her father moved to Bath, and after Bath in 1805, after father's death, 2 sisters and mother moved to Southampton. They moved to their mother's cousin's estate, where they stayed for almost 15-20 years. Jane Austen started writing at an early age, and her earliest known writings date from about 1787. Now she started writing diaries first and letters also. Here I would like to mention that a woman who begins to write, she started writing in a very male-dominating fashion. At the same time, she had entered into a discipline which was dominated by men. She was walking on an untrodden path, and she did not have any ideals before her. There were no great women writers before her, but then she had her own way of writing. And this reminds me of a feminist theory which says that a woman writes, she begins with diary. She begins with her own experiences, that is, either with diary or with an autobiography, or she would go on writing letters, because these are the very handy forms. Women who are not trained in poetry, formally trained in writing poetry, it becomes difficult for them to write poetry. Women who do not have exposure of the outside world, it is difficult for them to write about plays because they don't have theatrical details. So for them, these genres like diary writing, autobiography writing, letters, they are very handy. And in the same similar fashion, Jane Austen started writing diaries. It is also said that it serves as scriptotherapy, because writing is therapeutic. When there is a cathartic compulsion, a writer needs to write out something, and this is from her letters to her sister Cassandra. It becomes evident that writing was a need for her. Here, Vaibhabai, I remember one incident that is by Indira Goswami. I was reading an article titled "How I Became a Writer." There, Indira Goswami says at the end of the essay that writing, amidst all my sufferings and amidst all my pain, writing became a golden key. And so it was this golden key, I think. Jane Austen also found that golden key at a very early in her age. Some of her earlier works were published anonymously. I think all of her, not only some, all of her works were published anonymously. She never married during her lifetime, and she never had a room of her own. It is also said that she used to hide her manuscripts from her cousins, from her niece, from her nephews. She would write in her private chamber, and nobody was allowed there, because writing was not considered good for women. So she never had a room of her own. She used to camouflage not only her writings but also her personality. She died on July 1870 in Winchester at the age of 41. It is said that she died of Addison's disease, and some believe that no, it was because of tuberculosis. We don't know, but she died at the age of 41. But she is being made memorable by her works, and we know her as one of the most prolific writers of today's time. In her works, we can see Sense and Sensibility. It was actually written in 1795, but first the publishers rejected. Without reading the script, Sense and Sensibility was rejected because it was written by a woman. She had titled it as Eleanor and Marian. Then during the publication, she changed the title and it became Sense and Sensibility. It was the same case with Pride and Prejudice, that she wrote it as First Impressions. It was again written in around 1795. It got rejected, and she published it in 1813, Mansfield Park, 1840, Emma, a very well-known novel, 1815. These are her posthumous publications. The first two were published by her very dear brother Henry. One is Persuasion and Northanger Abbey. Northanger Abbey, she had started writing earlier around 1790, but it got published in 1817, and unfinished novel Sandition was published in 1925. So these are the major works. There are also some works like Love and Friendship and some stories by Jane Austen, but these are the major works that we know today, and that is what she is known as a writer today. Critics, one critic, that is Sir Walter Scott, her contemporary, he wrote, it's a great tribute. He says that that young lady has a talent for describing the involvements of feelings and characters of ordinary life, which is to me the most wonderful I ever met with. So, this is one of the best tributes by contemporary writer. And Virginia Woolf, as I said earlier, she called Austen the most perfect artist among women. So these are the popular critical views on Austen. This is the cover page of Austen's book Emma. This is Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. This is Pride and Prejudice. This is Persuasion, Northanger Abbey. And these are the letters of Jane Austen that she wrote to her sister Cassandra. It is said that Cassandra had destroyed many of her letters and also part of her diaries. So now I request Vaibhav Bhai to tell us something about Austen's historical background, because Austen in her novels strangely does not talk about history of her time. So now I request Vaibhav Bhai to tell us something about Austen's historical background. Vaibhav Bhai.
Thank you, ma'am. Good morning, friends. We know by now that Jane Austen has been wrongly termed as a domestic writer, and in fact, I would like to call her the goddess of small things, because she has concentrated upon the seemingly small things of life, which nobody wants to focus their attention upon. And like Virginia Woolf, she also talks about the trivialities of life,